Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
"You've always been selfish," my father said, his voice sharp and loaded with that same cold disapproval I'd grown up hearing every time I dared to make a choice that didn't benefit someone else in the family. It wasn't even a conversation, more like a declaration, a judgment passed without trial, just because I'd finally said no for once in my life. And the worst part wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them, like it was some universally accepted truth, like it was a fact everyone else already agreed on. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or try to defend myself. I just sat there with the phone pressed to my ear and let his words fall into the same bottomless pit where years of his opinions had already gathered like dust on forgotten furniture. But even though I stayed silent in that moment, something inside me shifted, something deep, something final. I wish I could say that moment came as a shock, but honestly, it didn't. It was just the latest in a long line of subtle slaps, small betrayals, and carefully disguised disappointments that had shaped my entire childhood. My brother Ethan had always been the sun around which my parents orbited, and I'd learned early that trying to compete with that kind of gravitational pull was a waste of energy. He could do no wrong, even when he very obviously did wrong. Late-night calls from the police station were brushed off as youthful mistakes. Failing classes became, "He's just not a test taker." Blowing through money? "He's learning responsibility." Meanwhile, if I so much as left a dish in the sink or came home 5 minutes past curfew, the entire house turned into a courtroom and I was always on trial. I remember coming home from school one day with an award, first place in a statewide essay contest. I'd stayed up late for weeks researching, drafting, rewriting. I was proud, excited, maybe even a little hopeful that this time I'd done something worthy of attention. My mother glanced at the certificate and said, "That's nice," before asking if I'd remembered to vacuum the living room. My father didn't say anything at all. That same night, Ethan crashed my mom's car backing out of the driveway. No license, no insurance, and my parents spent the entire evening comforting him. I vacuumed the living room in silence, certificate still rolled up in my backpack. By the time I was 16, I was working after school to pay for my own clothes, my own phone, even some of my own school supplies when I didn't want to hear the sighs and lectures about how expensive everything had become. College wasn't even a discussion. If I wanted to go, I had to figure it out on my own. So I did. I filled out every form, every scholarship application, every financial aid document. I took student loans, worked weekends, and sometimes skipped meals just to stretch my budget far enough to survive. And still, even as I pushed myself to exhaustion, I never heard a single word of encouragement from them. Ethan, meanwhile, floated through life like a balloon someone forgot to tie down, always drifting but never falling, because no matter how reckless he was, they were always there to catch him. But I kept going. I finished school, got a job, and slowly started building a life of my own. Nothing flashy, nothing extravagant, just steady. Quiet success, the kind no one in my family noticed because it didn't come with fireworks or drama. I never told them much, never bragged, never flaunted anything. I just worked hard, saved wisely, and stayed in my own lane. And maybe, deep down, I still wanted them to notice, still hoped one day they'd say, "We're proud of you." But that day never came. I was the invisible daughter, the dependable one, the one they didn't have to worry about, and so they didn't. Still, I was doing better than they thought. I wasn't rich by any means, but I was stable. I had a decent apartment, no debt, a growing savings account, and a quiet little side hustle that was starting to pay off more than I expected. But I kept all that to myself. I knew better than to share good news with people who only saw me as a backup plan. I knew better than to expect applause from an audience that had never clapped for me once. And then they called me, not to check in, not to ask how I was doing or if I needed anything. Not to congratulate me on anything, not even to say hello. They called me because they needed something. Something big. Something that would test everything I'd spent years rebuilding. Something that would tear open the old wounds I'd worked so hard to heal. And the second I heard my mother's voice on the line, too sweet, too rehearsed, I already knew it had nothing to do with love and everything to do with obligation. But what they didn't know was that I'd stopped feeling obligated a long, long time ago. The call came late on a Thursday, just as I was settling into the kind of quiet evening I'd learned to savor in recent years, a warm dinner, a glass of wine, and the satisfying silence of a life no longer tangled in other people's chaos. I almost didn't answer when I saw my mother's name flash across the screen, because we weren't the type of family that called just to talk. If the phone rang, it meant something was wrong, or more likely, they needed something. Still, some old reflex in me picked up, that childhood habit of hoping maybe this time the conversation would be different. Maybe this time they'd ask how I was. Maybe this time they'd just want to hear my voice. But I should have known better. There was no small talk, no warmth, no soft bridge between hello and the ask. My mother's voice was sticky sweet, the kind she used when she was trying to wrap guilt in a bow and make it sound like love. "We were just wondering," she said, drawing out the words like syrup, "if you'd be willing to co-sign a mortgage loan for your brother." It took me a second to respond, not because I didn't understand, but because my entire body had gone still with disbelief. I blinked, stared at the wall, and let her words echo around my living room like some kind of joke I hadn't caught the punchline to yet. Co-sign a mortgage loan for Ethan. The same Ethan who hadn't held a steady job for more than 6 months since college. The same Ethan who'd burned through every opportunity like it was a cigarette he never intended to finish. The same Ethan who still owed me money from the time I'd quietly paid off his credit card debt so our parents wouldn't find out. My gut reaction was no. A hard, unshakable, deeply rooted no that rose up from somewhere in my chest and sat heavily on my tongue. But for a moment, just one, I hesitated. Because that old part of me, the part trained to keep the peace, to shoulder responsibility, to smooth out the messes no one else wanted to deal with, that part still existed. It still flinched at the idea of being seen as cold, as difficult, as selfish. And for just a second, I let my mother keep talking. She said it wasn't a big deal, that I wouldn't even have to pay anything, that it was just a formality because the bank wanted a stronger credit profile. I listened in silence while she spun the situation into something harmless, something reasonable, something I should feel guilty for even thinking about refusing. But I knew better. I knew Ethan's credit wasn't just weak, it was scorched earth. He'd defaulted on car payments, maxed out cards, and once took out a personal loan for a business venture that never got past the logo design stage. I knew if I signed that loan, I'd be the one footing the bill the second things went south, and with Ethan, things always went south. Then my father got on the line, and the manipulation came sharper, less disguised. "Family helps family," he said, in that condescending tone he always used when he wanted to sound righteous. "What good is all your success if you can't even help your own brother?" That sentence clung to me like smoke, thick and suffocating, implying that my worth was only measured by how much I was willing to bleed for someone else. He didn't ask about my finances, didn't consider what it would mean for my credit, didn't care about my boundaries. He just assumed I'd cave, because I always had. Then came the real gut punch, my mother's voice, softer now, like she was offering a lullaby instead of a guilt trip. "He just needs a little push, honey. Just a little help to get on his feet. You know how hard it's been for him." As if Ethan's failures were a storm that had happened to him, not the result of every reckless decision he'd made with full awareness and zero consequence. As if his endless second chances were somehow my responsibility to uphold. I took a deep breath, stood up from the couch, and walked to the window while they kept talking. I watched a neighbor's dog run across the yard, ears flopping, oblivious to the weight of expectations that families like mine knew how to place so carefully on the shoulders of the ones least likely to say no. And then I did what they didn't expect. I said it. Calmly. Clearly. Without a trace of apology. "I'm not co-signing the loan. I won't risk my financial future for Ethan's mistakes. I'm sorry, but the answer is no." There was a pause, thick, stunned, disbelieving. Then my father snapped. "You've always been selfish. No wonder you're alone." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let him see the flicker of pain his words stirred, not because they were true, but because they were old wounds he loved to press when things didn't go his way. I simply said, if that's what you need to tell yourself, go ahead, and hung up the phone. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I poured another glass of wine, sat back down, and stared at the wall for a few minutes, letting the silence settle. And then, for the first time in a long time, I smiled. Because they had no idea what was coming next. What my parents never knew, what they never even bothered to ask about, was that while they were busy calling me selfish and holding up Ethan as the golden child, I had quietly been building a life they never saw coming. I had spent years making careful choices, saying no to flashy distractions, skipping vacations I couldn't afford, and putting every extra dollar into savings accounts and side hustles they never knew existed. I wasn't rich, at least not in the way people picture yachts and private jets, but I had something far more powerful: security, independence, and a slowly growing fortune I'd built from grit, discipline, and silence. It started 5 years ago, back when I was working a soul-numbing job in an office that smelled like printer toner and recycled air. I hated every second of it, but I kept showing up, saving as much of my paycheck as I could. Watching tutorials late into the night about real estate investing and passive income streams while my coworkers spent their weekends at overpriced brunches and bottomless mimosa parties. I skipped the cocktails, skipped the shopping sprees, skipped the false sense of arrival that came with brand new things and monthly car payments. Instead, I scraped together a down payment and bought my first rental property, a tired 2-bedroom duplex in a neighborhood nobody was talking about yet. It wasn't glamorous. It had water stains on the ceiling and a furnace that groaned louder than my old boss during staff meetings. But I fixed it up little by little, rented it out to a kind woman with 2 kids who paid on time and always said thank you. The monthly checks weren't huge, but they were steady, and I didn't spend them. I reinvested every penny, bought a second property a year later, then a third. By the time I was in my late 30s, I owned 4 properties outright and had equity in a 5th. No one in my family knew a thing about it. I never bragged. I never flaunted it. I let them keep believing I was barely scraping by, that I was the one who'd never quite figured out how to make it. I had watched over the years as Ethan stumbled through job after job, racking up credit card debt and blaming everyone but himself for every missed opportunity. I watched him lease a new car he couldn't afford, invest in pyramid schemes that collapsed in months, and borrow money from everyone in the family like it was his birthright. And through it all, my parents kept enabling him, calling his mistakes bad luck, and treating my silence as proof that I had nothing of my own going on. I let them believe that because I didn't need their praise. I needed distance. I needed peace. Then, not even a week after that phone call where I refused to co-sign his loan, I ran into an old neighbor, someone who used to live across the street from my parents back when I was still in high school. We chatted for a few minutes, catching up, and somewhere in the conversation, she mentioned that Ethan's house deal had fallen through. Apparently, the bank had denied the loan after reviewing his credit history, and without a co-signer, there was no way he'd get approved again. My father had been ranting about it to anyone who would listen, blaming me for the whole thing, saying I had cost Ethan his future by refusing to step up when it mattered most. I didn't get angry. I didn't even feel surprised. I just nodded politely and walked away, my mind already spinning with a decision that felt so obvious, it was like it had been waiting for this moment all along. So I bought the house. In cash. No mortgage, no negotiations, no second thoughts. I called my agent the next morning, told her I wanted to buy the property outright, and within 72 hours, the deal was done. I signed the papers, transferred the funds from one of my investment accounts, and held the deed in my hands before the weekend even arrived. The same house Ethan had desperately tried to buy, the one my parents claimed was the perfect start for his new life, now belonged to me. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. I wanted them to find out the way they'd always delivered their judgments, secondhand, through whispers and rumors and conversations they thought I wasn't meant to hear. I wanted to watch the realization settle into their bones, slow and sharp like ice under the skin. But I wasn't done yet. I finalized the deal quietly, without fanfare or ceremony, just a few phone calls to my lawyer, a wire transfer from my investment account, and some paperwork signed in the back office of a modest little law firm on the edge of town. The entire transaction was done under a trust I'd created years ago, with my name nowhere near the public records, because the last thing I wanted was my parents or my brother catching wind of it too soon. I wanted the silence to stretch just long enough for the truth to hit them at full force, like a cold wind cutting through their self-righteous little narratives. The house was officially mine before the weekend was over, and the strange thing was how anticlimactic it felt at first. Just a crisp manila envelope, a title deed inside, keys wrapped in a paper sleeve with a sticky note that read, "Congratulations." But when I walked through the front door for the first time, with nothing but those keys in my hand and a quiet sense of purpose humming in my chest, it hit me harder than I expected. The house was beautiful in that clean, suburban, cookie-cutter way, the kind of place people took pride in because it looked like everyone else's: neat lawns, white shutters, a two-car garage, and a porch swing that someone had clearly installed with a vision of family barbecues and summer evenings. Inside, everything was new and shiny: freshly painted walls in soft neutral tones, hardwood floors that creaked just enough to feel real, and a kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that practically gleamed under the overhead lights. It had a small home office with a window that overlooked the backyard, and I stood there for a long time just imagining how my father must have pictured Ethan sitting there, pretending to be responsible for the first time in his life. The upstairs hallway led to 3 modest bedrooms, each with clean carpeting and enough closet space to suggest a life of comfort, but not extravagance. One of them had already been painted a pale blue, probably chosen with some imaginary future child in mind, a nursery that would never be used now, a dream that would never quite come true. I ran my fingers along the doorframe, wondering if they had planned to repaint it once Ethan's mythical family expanded, or if they were just waiting for me to say yes and hand them their future on a silver platter. And now it was mine. This was the house they wanted for him, the house they told everyone he deserved, the house they fought to get him, until I refused to sign away my peace and tie my financial future to his train wreck of a life. And in some small, twisted way, I felt sorry for the house. It had been promised to people who didn't respect anything they hadn't been handed. It had been meant to hold a version of a life that was never going to happen, not because of me, but because they refused to believe that their golden boy had turned to rust a long time ago. I stood in the living room for a while, just letting the silence settle in, letting the stillness of the space wrap around me like a strange kind of vindication. No furniture, no noise, just echoes and clean air, and a sense that something old and heavy had finally snapped off my shoulders. Then I pulled the deed from my bag and laid it flat on the kitchen island, the same one they'd gushed about during the open house, saying it was perfect for hosting family dinners. I'd had it framed earlier that morning, a simple black frame with no embellishments, just the cold hard proof that this house, this future, belonged to me now. I left the deed right there on the kitchen table, like a piece of art on display, a quiet middle finger painted in legal ink. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with the house, whether I'd live in it, rent it out, or let it sit empty for a while just so they'd know it wasn't being used the way they'd imagined. Maybe I'd donate it, maybe I'd sell it, maybe I'd turn it into something meaningful, but at that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that I'd done something for myself, without apology, without permission, and without owing anyone a damn thing. Then I heard a knock on the door. I don't know how they found out, whether it was the neighbor who'd mentioned seeing someone at the house, or maybe Ethan finally asked the right question at the wrong time and someone slipped. Either way, it didn't take long before they were at the front door, pounding their fists like they had a legal claim to my time, my money, my decisions, and now, apparently, my property. I was in the kitchen when I heard the knocking, slow at first, then louder, more urgent. The kind of knock that says, "We're not leaving until you open up," and I knew before I even peeked through the window who it was. My parents stood on the porch like they owned it, like they had every right to be furious, and I took my time opening the door, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted them to stew in the moment. I had a cup of tea in my hand and the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove, nothing to defend, nothing to apologize for anymore. When I finally opened the door, My father didn't waste a single second before launching into his tirade, his voice already rising, already thick with indignation and accusation. "You bought his house," he shouted, pointing behind me like the furniture and walls had betrayed him personally. "You think this is funny? Some kind of sick joke? What the hell is wrong with you?" I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just leaned against the doorframe and took another sip of tea, letting the silence stretch just a little longer before I answered. "No joke," I said softly, "just business." My mother was already crying by then, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, tears streaking her cheeks in perfectly rehearsed patterns. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice cracking. This was supposed to be Ethan's start, his home, his chance to finally get on his feet. I didn't roll my eyes, but I wanted to. It was always about Ethan, always about giving him one more chance, one more handout, one more benefit of the doubt. Never mind that he'd burned through every opportunity like it was his God-given right to waste them. Never mind that he was grown, capable, and entirely unwilling to take responsibility for his own life. I'd spent years watching them twist themselves into emotional pretzels trying to justify his mistakes, and here they were again, still expecting me to sacrifice so he could stumble forward on my shoulders. "You ruined his future," my father spat, stepping closer like proximity could somehow make his words sting more. "Do you even care what this did to him? What kind of person does something like this to her own family?" That's when I knew they still didn't get it, still didn't see me as anything but an extension of their expectations, a wallet with legs and a face they didn't bother to look at unless they needed something. I turned around without saying a word, walked back into the house, and returned with the framed deed in my hands. I held it out to them without a single word, just held it there between us like a mirror they couldn't avoid looking into. My name was printed clean and clear across the top, no trust name, no anonymous shell company, just me. They stared at it like it had physically hit them in the face. My mother's lips parted but no words came out, and for the first time in my life, my father didn't have a response ready. I waited a moment longer, then finally broke the silence with a voice so steady it didn't even feel like mine anymore. "You called me selfish," I said. "Now I own the house your selfless son couldn't afford." The words didn't come out bitter or cruel, just factual, like I was reading them from a ledger, just one line in a long record of debts paid and balances overdue. My father's jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grind, and my mother clutched her chest like I'd delivered a physical blow. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. What I said next, that's what left them speechless. I watched them stare at that framed deed like it was a weapon, but the truth was it wasn't about the house. Not really. It was about everything it represented. It was about the quiet years they ignored me, the sacrifices they never acknowledged, the expectations they piled on my shoulders like bricks until I nearly forgot what standing tall even felt like. It was about every time they called me selfish while handing Ethan excuse after excuse, every time they overlooked my effort, my independence, my success, because it didn't fit into the little narrative they'd built around who deserved what. And now that the story had changed, and they weren't the ones holding the pen, they didn't know what to do with themselves. I let the silence hang a moment longer before I spoke again, this time with no malice, no theatrics, just calm, deliberate clarity. "If you still want to live here," I said, slowly and without blinking, "you can. But it'll be under my terms, on my conditions, and for rent you'd actually have to pay." My father looked at me like I'd just insulted his very existence, and in a way, maybe I had, not with cruel words, but with something worse to a man like him, boundaries. His mouth twisted in a sneer, and he let out that bitter scoff I'd heard my whole life whenever he thought someone had the audacity to challenge him. "You're kidding," he said, shaking his head like I was a child playing house, like I couldn't possibly mean it. "You want us to pay you rent? In this house?" I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just nodded and said, "That's right." And I expected on time. My mother started crying again, and this time it wasn't that well-practiced sob she always pulled out when she wanted to manipulate a situation. It was messy, it was loud, and it was real. She kept saying things like, "This isn't you," and "We're family," and "You don't mean this," but every word sounded hollow in the space between us. Because deep down, she knew I didn't mean it. She just didn't want to accept that the girl they'd always dismissed, always overlooked, had finally stopped playing by their script. I set the framed deed down on the counter beside me and stood a little taller, not with bitterness or spite, but with something cleaner, a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. "You didn't need a co-signer," I said, locking eyes with my father and watching the truth hit him harder than anything I could have screamed. "You needed a scapegoat. Someone to carry Ethan's mess so you wouldn't have to admit he's not the man you wanted him to be." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Not a single argument. Not a single defense. Because he knew I was right. I walked them to the door slowly, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I wanted them to feel every step of it, every inch of the space they once expected to control, now standing firmly under my terms. They paused at the threshold like they thought I might change my mind, like maybe I'd soften again and do what I'd always done, make room for their disappointment, swallow my pride, patch up their mistakes. But I didn't. I simply said, "Take care of yourselves," and shut the door behind them. In the weeks that followed, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not my friends, not my coworkers, not even Linda from the coffee shop who'd seen the framed deed and raised her eyebrows with a knowing smirk. I didn't rent the house out, didn't list it on any platform, didn't turn it into an investment property, even though I easily could have. Instead, I walked through those quiet rooms one last time, thinking about what this place could have been if it had gone to the wrong hands, and then I made a decision that surprised even me. I donated it. I signed the deed over to a nonprofit that helps single mothers rebuild their lives, women who've been pushed aside, ignored, underestimated, just like I'd been for most of mine. Women who needed not just shelter, but a fresh start, a second chapter without debt or guilt or strings attached. And when the representative from the organization asked me why, I just said, "Let someone else build a better story here." And that was it. I drove away from the house one final time, windows down, sunlight on my face, and not once did I look back. Because for the first time, I wasn't haunted by what I'd left behind. I was proud of it. I was proud that I didn't let bitterness dictate my ending, that I chose peace over revenge, freedom over resentment. I didn't need to see their faces again or hear another apology wrapped in excuses. I never wanted revenge. I just wanted peace. And now I had it. If they ever call again, maybe I won't answer at all.